The moment the doctor closed the file, Catherine's entire world shattered, and what he said next was something no mother, and no future queen, was ever supposed to hear. She walked in smiling. There was no emergency tone, no urgency, no warning. Just another routine request from the palace medical team, the kind that had come before, the kind that never carried danger. And yet, within seconds of sitting down, Catherine understood something was wrong. Because when the doctor closed the folder, the room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, heavy, controlled. And then he spoke. Not gently, not cautiously, clinically. That was the moment everything shifted. Why was this test conducted without her full understanding? Why did it feel like a conclusion had already been reached? And why did no one look surprised? This matters because this isn't just a private family concern. This is the future of the monarchy. This is about Prince Louis, a child born into global visibility and a system that appears to have moved ahead without full transparency. Catherine had answered dozens of medical briefings before. Developmental check-ins, routine monitoring, standard evaluations expected for a royal child under intense public scrutiny. But this time, something felt different before she even entered the room. Palace halls have a rhythm. Staff greet warmly. Conversations hum. That day, there was whispering, doors closing softly, eyes avoiding contact. Inside the medical wing, the air felt clinical, composed, almost rehearsed. Prince Louis had undergone examinations, yes, but she had been reassured repeatedly. Precautionary, nothing alarming, just careful monitoring. Yet the expressions across the table told another story. Tight jaws, measured pauses, words chosen with surgical precision. And then came language no parent is ever prepared to hear. Not speculation, not possibility. Conclusion. The physician spoke as if this moment had been approaching for some time. As if today wasn't discovery, it was confirmation. That was what broke her composure. Because if this had been developing quietly, who knew? And for how long? Witnesses later described the sound of a chair scraping back sharply. A sudden intake of breath. Hands trembling. This wasn't confusion. It was the realization that something may have been unfolding behind protocol, behind polite reassurances, behind carefully controlled updates. And within minutes, palace machinery activated. Phones were silenced. Internal communication channels restricted. Conversations mid-sentence stopped. Orders were issued without explanation. Catherine was escorted out, not publicly, not dramatically, but efficiently, through a corridor rarely used, away from visible areas. Staff were instructed not to speculate, not to discuss, not to recall what they had observed, because whatever had just been revealed was never meant to circulate. But silence inside institutions rarely holds perfectly, and this is where the story deepens. Because if the diagnosis had truly just been confirmed that day, why did the doctors speak as though it was expected? Why were preliminary evaluations described as delayed documentation? And who made the decision to wait? The palace has always prioritized stability, optics, continuity. But when reputation management intersects with a child's health, priorities shift, or at least they should. For Catherine, this moment was no longer about royal duty. It was about instinct. Because mothers notice small changes long before systems do. And as she replayed every recent memory of Prince Louis, every public appearance, every quiet pause, every subtle hesitation, the questions multiplied. What had she missed? Or worse, what had been minimized? And what would happen if the truth could no longer be contained? Before the diagnosis, before the briefing, before the silence in that clinical room, there were signs. Small ones, easy to dismiss. Prince Louis had always been described as the playful spark of the family, the mischievous grin, the child who stole the spotlight during balcony appearances, the one whose expressions became viral moments. But behind the carefully curated photographs and orchestrated public events, something quieter was unfolding. And some people noticed. It started subtly. A slight delay in responding to his name during a recorded birthday message. A pause that lingered a few seconds too long during a garden appearance. Moments where he seemed distant, as though the noise of royal engagements swallowed him whole. Online, those clips were labeled adorable. Commentators laughed about him being cheeky or overwhelmed. But inside palace walls, whispers began. Staff assigned to event coordination quietly observed how quickly he tired. After only minutes of waving, He would grip Catherine's hand tightly, his energy fading faster than expected. During ceremonies, he sometimes appeared unfocused, blinking slowly, disengaged. Was it just a child overwhelmed by attention? Or something more? Here's where the story takes a turn. According to insiders, it wasn't Catherine who first raised formal concern. It was the nanny. Softly, carefully, in a conversation with a senior aide. She had cared for other children. She understood developmental pacing. And she noticed differences, moments where instructions needed repeating, where balance wavered unexpectedly, where overstimulation seemed to freeze him rather than excite him. She wasn't sounding alarm bells. She was asking questions. But in a royal structure built on hierarchy and caution, questions can feel like threats. Catherine, however, sensed it long before anyone voiced it aloud. Mothers often do. She began replaying home videos late at night, rewatching interactions, looking for patterns, searching for reassurance. But instead of comfort, she found inconsistencies. There were pauses, gaps, subtle coordination delays that once seemed harmless but now carried weight. When she gently raised concerns with palace medical staff, she was met with reassurance. Boys develop differently. He's under immense spotlight. He just needs time. Time. That word echoed. Because developmental windows are measured in time. Interventions depend on time. Assessments require time. And yet, requests for deeper evaluations moved slowly. Raised the question no one wanted to answer. Why were formal tests requested but not immediately scheduled? Documents show consultations were discussed weeks before they occurred. Administrative approvals were required. Palace physicians needed alignment with external specialists. Optics were considered. Privacy was emphasized. But while meetings were being arranged and protocols reviewed, Catherine felt something slipping, not dramatically, but gradually. She began to feel tension in responses. Polite deflections. Conversations redirected towards scheduling and press considerations rather than medical clarity. And then came the contradiction. Specialists had apparently been quietly consulted before Catherine received definitive answers. If that's true, it changes everything. Because that would mean the system had concerns earlier, but chose controlled pacing over immediate transparency. And that realization is what makes Section 1 so devastating. By the time Catherine sat in that clinical room, this may not have been new information to everyone else. Which raises the question, was she the last to know? And if so, why? Because in institutions where legacy is protected at all costs, silence can become policy. But silence has consequences. And soon, Catherine would discover that asking for answers would place her in conflict not with a diagnosis, but with the palace itself.
I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been recovering from surgery. It has been an incredibly tough couple of months for our entire family.
The diagnosis was only the beginning. What followed was something Catherine never anticipated, not medical uncertainty, but institutional resistance. Because once she began asking direct questions, the tone inside the palace shifted. At first, it was subtle. She requested second opinions, independent specialists, external evaluations beyond the palace's preferred circle of consultants. The response? Not yet. Let's wait. These results are preliminary. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, careful, responsible. But beneath the language was something colder. Control. Race, why this matters. When medical clarity becomes entangled with reputation management, the process changes. Decisions slow. Messaging tightens. Risk assessments expand beyond health into optics. And Catherine could feel it. Meetings became procedural rather than personal. Discussions centered on how information might be interpreted publicly rather than what interventions might be needed privately. Each well-worded refusal carried the same underlying message: stay aligned. She wasn't being told no outright. She was being delayed. And delay, in matters involving developmental windows, carries weight. Tension quietly escalated between Catherine and senior advisors, individuals loyal not to her personally, but to the institution itself. One late evening, according to sources, she confronted a trusted private secretary. Her voice was steady but strained. Are you protecting my son, or protecting the crown? There was no clean answer to that question. And that silence said everything. Prince William found himself in an impossible position: husband, father, and future king. Raised to prioritize stability above all else, he understood the machinery of the monarchy intimately. He believed in process, in patience, in hierarchy. Catherine, however, was operating from instinct. He urged caution, encouraged trust in established channels. But for her, every additional week felt like lost ground. And then came another layer. Senior figures, including King Charles, were reportedly briefed. The response was described as composed, measured, focused on continuity and discretion. Legacy, responsibility, stability. What was reportedly missing from that conversation? Louis' name. That omission unsettled Catherine deeply, because in that moment, she realized she wasn't simply navigating a medical path. She was confronting an institution designed to minimize disruption at all costs. Even whispers began circulating that her growing urgency was being framed as emotional strain, that she was overreacting, that stress might be influencing her judgment. Those suggestions were never formal accusations, but they existed just enough to isolate her. And hey, raise the rehook. What if the resistance wasn't about denying care, but about managing timing? If an official statement ever became necessary, it would need preparation, coordination, narrative control. Catherine, however, wasn't thinking about narrative. She was thinking about intervention. The more she pushed, the colder the responses felt. Appointments required additional authorization. External outreach was discouraged. Conversations shifted back to internal review processes. She began to feel like she was fighting for permission to ask questions. And that realization changed everything. Because this was no longer about a single diagnosis. It was about autonomy. About whether a mother inside the most structured institution in the world could act independently when it mattered most. And just when tensions were reaching a breaking point, the silence fractured. Not from her, but from somewhere deep inside the palace walls.
But I've had a fantastic medical team who've taken great care of me, for which I'm so grateful. In January, I underwent major abdominal surgery in London, and at the time, it was thought that my condition was non-cancerous.
The palace believed it could contain the situation. It had done so before. Quiet internal reviews, carefully timed disclosures, statements polished until they revealed nothing while appearing transparent. But this time, something slipped. It didn't begin with a headline. It began with an encrypted message. A fragment of internal medical correspondence surfaced not public at first, but circulated quietly among royal correspondents and legal intermediaries. It referenced evaluation timelines, early concerns, dates that did not align with the official narrative of recent findings. And that discrepancy was explosive, because if assessments had been discussed weeks, even months before Catherine was formally briefed, then the story was no longer about a diagnosis. It was about delay. Within hours, palace media teams were alerted. Communications staff shifted into containment mode. Legal departments evaluated exposure risk. Senior advisors convened emergency meetings. But the tone was different now. This was not proactive management. This was reaction. Journalists began asking carefully worded questions. Why had external specialists been consulted earlier than disclosed? Who authorized postponements? Were parental requests overridden by advisory panels? No accusations were made publicly, but the silence had cracked. And once doubt enters public perception, control becomes fragile. Inside the palace, tension intensified. Some advisors reportedly argued for a preemptive clarification, a limited acknowledgement to close speculation. Others insisted silence was still the safest course. Meanwhile, Catherine faced an entirely different reality. The private fear she had been carrying was now colliding with public scrutiny. What had once been a personal battle was becoming a constitutional one. Because if it appeared that palace protocol delayed medical clarity for a royal child, the implications extended beyond family dynamics. It raised structural questions. Who ultimately decides when health concerns are addressed? Where does parental authority end and institutional authority begin? And perhaps most critically, does the monarchy protect individuals or protect itself? Here is the deeper tension. The monarchy survives on stability, predictability, the perception of continuity. Any sign of vulnerability is managed with precision. But vulnerability involving a child is different. It humanizes the institution. It exposes its limits. As reporters pursued confirmation, insiders described an atmosphere of controlled urgency. Not panic, but recalibration. Messaging drafts were prepared and discarded. Timelines reviewed. Language softened, then tightened again. Catherine, for the first time, was no longer isolated in her questions. The leak had validated what she feared. That information had been compartmentalized long before she was fully informed. And that realization altered her posture entirely. She was no longer asking quietly. She was demanding accountability. Not publicly, not dramatically, but firmly. Because when silence is used to preserve image, it risks undermining trust. And trust is the monarchy's most fragile currency. The institution may still attempt to regain narrative control, but the fundamental question remains unresolved. If truth was delayed once, what guarantees transparency now? And as the world watches for clarity, the palace faces something it rarely encounters: uncertainty it cannot choreograph.
The surgery was successful. However, tests after the operation found cancer had been present. My medical team therefore advised that I should undergo a course of preventative chemotherapy, and I'm now in the early stages of that treatment.
This story is not simply about a medical diagnosis. It is about power and proximity to it. It is about what happens when maternal instinct collides with institutional preservation, when urgency meets hierarchy, when personal vulnerability intersects with constitutional tradition. If the reported delays were procedural, the palace must explain them. If they were strategic, the implications are far more serious. Because the monarchy does not operate like an ordinary family. Its decisions ripple outward, affecting public confidence, constitutional perception, and generational continuity. For Catherine, this moment appears transformative, not because it revealed weakness, but because it clarified alignment. Her fight was never against tradition itself. It was against delay, against opacity, against the possibility that timing was valued over immediacy. And for the public, the questions remain open. What did advisors know and when? Who determined the pacing of medical intervention? Was reputation management prioritized over transparency? The monarchy has weathered crises before. It adapts. It recalibrates. It survives. But survival depends on trust. If the institution wishes to preserve stability, it must confront perception head-on. Silence, once broken, cannot simply be restored. And perhaps the most unresolved tension of all is this. When the next decision arises, will the palace choose protection of image or protection of its own?
If you enjoy in-depth coverage of the stories shaping celebrity culture and entertainment, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay connected for the next big story.